Welcome, friends. We are continuing to talk through the Sermon on the Mount and Jesus' vision for kingdom life and how it goes beyond the righteousness of the Pharisees and the scribes and the teachers of the law who made it all about following the rules. And he wants to talk about how the kingdom of God begins to transform our hearts. And so he's talked about murder, the Old Testament law against murder, and how the root issue really is an issue of the heart and dealing with anger and contempt for others, the importance of reconciliation with others. And he's talked about adultery and how the root issue is more of an issue of lust in the heart and objectifying other people. That last issue really pointed at the men in the crowd and their tendency to do this with the women. And he wants to create a different kind of community. And this next teaching in the Sermon on the Mount on divorce is in some ways an extension of that conversation, again, directed heavily towards the men in the crowd, and also a bridge to the next topic that we'll get into next week on the importance of keeping our word to one another and the importance of covenantal faithfulness to one another. And so he's going to take what was in that day and is in our day as well, a hot topic, the issue of divorce, and how it was generally handled in his day. And again, going to largely be addressing the boys' club here with this teaching. And he's going to wade into these waters. And so let's hear what Jesus has to say, and then we'll unpack it together, okay? He says this in Matthew chapter 5, verse 31 and 32. It's been said, anyone who divorces his wife must give her a certificate of divorce. But I tell you that anyone who divorces his wife, except for sexual immorality, makes her the victim of adultery. And anyone who marries a divorced woman commits adultery. So, Jesus is addressing here an issue, a practice not on the level of murder and adultery in the form of the Old Testament law, but more of a tradition that had developed up around the Mosaic law and some allowances for how community existed in a fallen world when covenants break down. I know that when we read these verses, they're strong words from Jesus. They are pretty hard around the edges. And you need to know that for me, when I hear hard words from Jesus, which is about every other word he says, and some things with rough edges or things that are hard to understand, that I don't want to start from a position of explaining those away or trying to figure out how to soften the edges. For me, as a follower of Jesus, I want to let Jesus' words stand as they are. I think that we do well as followers of Jesus when we hear something that's confusing or difficult or hard, that we put ourselves underneath that teaching and trust that the wisdom of Jesus in this matter is better than our own. His perspective, his vision is going to lead us more into goodness and beauty and life than we would otherwise do on our own. Now, that said, there are regular times where Jesus will say something that's just really cryptic or difficult or hard to understand, or that is addressed to a specific cultural issue of that day. And if we're going to understand what it was that Jesus was doing, then we need to be aware of the cultural context and be able to translate that to our culture then. And I think this is one of those scenarios, because in Jesus' day, divorce and the practice around it was different than ours is today. And that's not to say ours is a whole lot better. It's just that they were different kinds of difficult experiences that humans walked through. But in Jesus' day, I think his teaching here is addressing some specific things around the practice of divorce in his day. And I want to talk through those. First off, the practice of divorce in Jesus' day was solely the prerogative and decision of the man. The men were the ones who made the decision about divorce in that day. The women were robbed of their agency in that decision. And you can imagine the dynamic that created in a marriage relationship and the power structures and systems that were in place there. that if a woman could never walk out of a marriage, but a man could send a woman away out of a marriage at his own will and discretion, that this just created an incredibly difficult dynamic. Especially when you consider that in that world, women and their contribution to society and their safety in society and value a lot of times was connected to their bearing children and raising families, and their security was tied up in the security of their household and their home in that way. And so if a man were to issue a certificate of divorce to a woman, their security was taken away from them, and they were left with not many bad options. All of the options they had were not great. One option was they could throw themselves on the mercy of their family and hopefully live with a relative. Another option was they could try and find a husband who would marry them again. But in that kind of scenario, very often the man would hold that new dynamic of marrying a divorced woman over the woman's head, and it would really dramatically impact that marriage relationship as well. Or too often, the women were robbed of any acceptable options, and in order to survive, they were forced into a life of prostitution so they could eat and have a place to stay. And this is the dynamic that divorce in Jesus' day was creating. And the debate around divorce in Jesus' day wasn't whether or not it should happen or anything like that. It was really a debate around legal terminology and what grounds of divorce a man could say were appropriate to send a wife away. So, I mean, translate this. In another way we could say it, the debate in the religious circles of the day were, in what circumstances can a man put a woman in that kind of impossible situation? So Jesus recognizes this as a real issue in communities in his day, and he wants to take it on. Now, there were two schools of thought around when it was acceptable or permissible for a man to issue a divorce certificate in his day. One school of thought was the school of Shammai, a leader and teacher in the Jewish tradition, and he had a whole school of thought developed around his teaching and an interpretation of the law. And in his school of thought, it was only permissible, not desirable, but permissible for a man to issue a certificate of divorce to a woman in the case of just a total breakdown of the covenant, something like adultery or some other just grievous break or infidelity to the covenant relationship. In those kinds of situations, Shammai said, okay, it's permissible. On the other hand, you had the school of thought of Hillel, and Hillel was another well-respected teacher. A lot of people subscribed to his thought and teaching, and in his view, it was acceptable and permissible for a man to issue a certificate of divorce to a woman for any and every reason. Imagine this. The examples that are often given from Hillel and his school of thought were if a woman burns the food that she cooks or doesn't season it correctly with the right amount of salt, or even sometimes we're told that a man could see another woman who he felt was more desirable, and even that was good enough to issue a certificate of divorce to his present wife and send her away. My goodness. So Jesus is entering into that debate in the culture and saying, we've got to address what this is doing to our communities, and especially to the most vulnerable among us, to our women. This debate between the school of Shammai and the school of Hillel raised itself up again and confronted Jesus again in Matthew chapter 19. And we see Jesus unpack a little bit more about marriage and divorce in Matthew 19. Somebody actually comes up to him, a Pharisee, a teacher of the law comes up to him and says, Jesus, and he puts it in the words of the school of Hillel, is it acceptable? Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for, and here's the phrase, any reason? That's the Hillel school of thought. Is that lawful, Jesus? We want to hear which school you land in. Now, Jesus does the typical Jesus judo move, and when he's trying to be pinned into a camp, he's going to resist that because he's representing a whole different way of understanding the world and kingdom that requires lots more conversation. But he doesn't want to get lumped into this school or that school. And so he's going to reframe the debate here in his response to this question. Rather than accepting the premise that this is the debate we ought to be having, is when is it acceptable for a man to send a woman away, he's going to resist that conversation altogether. And he answers instead like this in Matthew chapter 19, verses 4 through 6. He answered, "Have you not read that he who created them from the beginning made them male and female, and said, therefore, a man shall leave his father and his mother and hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. So they are no longer two, but one flesh. What therefore God has joined together, let not man separate." See, for Jesus, the issue of divorce wasn't a legal issue that took place in a courtroom with a piece of paper and a judge and a notary public. It wasn't just a simple kind of transaction between two legal parties. Marriage, when you got down to the root of it, was a change in the created order. When a man and a woman covenanted together in marriage and were joined together in sex, God creates a new union there, a oneness that didn't exist in creation before. And Jesus wants us to take a look at the intended order of marriage itself and to say, when God creates something new in the world, it's not even on human beings to try and get in the middle of that and take it apart. That can't easily be undone. It's a created order of the nature of existence now. A man and a woman have become one under the creation of God. So the Pharisees hear this, and they do the typical like, oh yeah, well, dad, mom said this, or mom, dad said this, and they try and find a way through it. They say to Jesus, oh yeah, well, Jesus, if that's the case, then why did Moses tell us that we could issue a certificate of divorce, And Jesus responds that the reason Moses allowed a certificate of divorce was because of the hardness of the human heart. And this is probably a whole other sermon, but there were ways that kind of permission, that if there was a total breakdown in a relationship, if there was such hardness of heart that it was leading to violence or the end of a way forward in life, that in order to preserve some life and make a way forward, Moses allowed it. Okay, well, we've got to figure out a way to do some, you could almost think of like triage surgery here and some amputation almost in order to disentangle these lives and create a path forward. But Jesus says this wasn't the way it was from the beginning. In the beginning, it wasn't like this. And then he repeats his teaching that we already read from chapter 5, that only under the most extreme circumstances should something like this even be attempted, that when a man and a woman come together in covenant, this is not meant to be undone except under the most impossible situations. And even then, Jesus wants us to envision a community where the hardness of the human heart doesn't make divorce a necessity. Anyone who has endured the pain of a broken marriage or been affected by one knows how much deeper divorce goes than a simple legal transaction. And even if it's the last resort and there are no other options for life to move forward, it still carries an incredible amount of pain. Divorce, though at rare times being the least bad option in a broken and fallen world of hard hearts, is something Jesus clearly teaches is not to be a normal experience in the kingdom of God community. And so much of this goes back to Jesus' teaching on the heart. Think about this. If Moses gave divorce for hard hearts, Jesus wants to envision a community of soft hearts, where divorce is not necessary because it functions, this community that he's establishing functions not according to the hardness of our heart, but according to the love and the faithfulness that God is placing within us. That its members might be spared the pain of divorce and broken marriages, and especially its women would be saved from that kind of vulnerability. I love the way that Dallas Willard puts it. He says in his book, Divine Conspiracy, hard hearts may make divorce necessary to avoid greater harm and hence make it permissible. But kingdom hearts are not hard, and they together can find ways to bear with each other, to speak truth in love, to change, often through times of great pain and distress, until the tender intimacy of mutual, covenant-framed love finds a way for the two lives to remain one, beautifully and increasingly. It's a great vision. And whatever your story is to this point in your life, I hope that this vision is one that inspires you to continue to allow your heart to be softened and shaped by the life of Jesus, who calls us into a community of soft hearts, of love, and of faithfulness, that by the grace of God is able to stay bound together in love across all sorts of different family dynamics as a witness to the steadfast faithfulness and love of God. Grace and peace, friends. Have a great day.